October 25th, 1415. A muddy field in northern France. 6,000 exhausted English soldiers watched 36,000 French knights and men-at-arms form battle lines across the valley. The English were sick, starving, and trapped. The French were confident, armored, and outnumbering them 6-1. Every calculation of medieval warfare said this would be a massacre. Then a 29-year-old king named Henry V stepped forward and delivered a speech that would echo through 600 years of history. He spoke of honor, of brotherhood, of how men who fought this day would be remembered forever. He called them his band of brothers and promised that those who shed blood with him would be his equals, no matter their birth. And the Battle of Agincourt would become the most celebrated victory in English history, the moment when impossible odds, English courage, and the longbow changed the course of the 100 Years' War. This is the story of Agincourt, the battle Shakespeare immortalized, the victory that made Henry V a legend, and the day when mud, arrows, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender defeated the finest army in Europe. Welcome to Britain's history. Today, we're diving into the battle that defined English military heritage, a fight where everything was stacked against the English, where defeat seemed certain, but where discipline, terrain, and the deadliest weapon in medieval warfare created a miracle. Because Agincourt wasn't about tactics alone. It was about a speech that inspired men to stand when retreat made sense, and a king who fought in the front line beside his soldiers. But before we get to that famous speech, before we watch English longbows darken the sky over French knights drowning in mud, we need to understand how Henry V ended up trapped in France with a dying army. Because without knowing the campaign that brought him to Agincourt, you can't appreciate the desperation that made this battle necessary, or the brilliance that made it victorious. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the battles that shaped Britain, the victories that built an empire, the defeats that taught hard lessons, the moments that made a nation. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1413, when 25-year-old Henry V inherited the English throne. His father, Henry IV, had usurped the crown, killing Richard II and plunging England into years of civil unrest. Young Henry faced a kingdom exhausted by internal conflict, nobles questioning his legitimacy, and France divided by civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians, looking vulnerable. Henry had a claim to the French throne through his great-grandfather, Edward III. It was a claim every English king had pressed for decades, leading to the 100 Years' War. But France had been winning recently. English territories in France had been shrinking. Henry saw an opportunity. France was weak, divided, distracted. If he moved decisively, he could reclaim lost English lands, perhaps even force France to acknowledge his claim to their crown. In August 1415, Henry invaded Normandy with 12,000 men. His target was Harfleur, a strategic port that would give England a permanent base in northern France. The siege began on August the 13th. Henry expected quick victory. He got a nightmare. Harfleur's garrison resisted fiercely for 5 weeks. English casualties mounted from combat. But disease was worse. Dysentery, the bloody flux, swept through the besieging army. Men died by the hundreds, writhing in agony as their bodies betrayed them. Others deserted, too sick to continue. By the time Harfleur surrendered on September 22nd, Henry's army was shattered. Of 12,000 men who'd landed, fewer than 6,000 remained combat effective. Think about Henry's position. You've conquered one town at enormous cost. Your army is dying from disease. Winter is coming. The sensible decision is to retreat to England, regroup, try again next year. But retreating after capturing only one town would look like failure. Your nobles would question your judgment. Your enemies would mock your weakness. What do? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Henry made an audacious decision. March to Calais, England's fortress in northern France, through hostile territory. It was a 120-mile march that should take 8 days. He'd parade his army through French lands, demonstrating English strength, then winter safely in Calais. It was a calculated risk. If the French didn't challenge him, he'd look bold. If they did, he had 6,000 professional soldiers who could fight their way out of trouble. The French did challenge him. Charles VI, France's mad king, couldn't command. He suffered psychotic episodes where he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. But his constable, Charles d'Albret, assembled the greatest French army in a generation. Dukes, counts, barons, French nobility answered the call. This was personal. The English had invaded France. Now they'd pay. The French shadowed Henry's march, blocking every ford across the Somme River. Henry was forced to march upstream, deeper into France, burning precious days and supplies. His men were exhausted, hungry, and terrified. Everyone knew the French were gathering strength. Everyone knew a battle was coming. On October 24th, near the village of Agincourt, the French army appeared blocking the road to Calais. Henry's retreat was cut off. The numbers were brutal. Henry had about 6,000 men, roughly 1,000 knights and men-at-arms, 5,000 longbowmen. The French had between 20,000 and 36,000 men. The exact number debated by historians, but everyone agrees the English were outnumbered at least 4-1, possibly 6-1. Worse, the French were fresh, well-fed, confident. The English were sick, starving, and demoralized. That night, both armies camped in sight of each other. English soldiers heard French nobles celebrating their coming victory, singing, joking about how many English they'd each kill. The French were so confident they reportedly gambled over who'd capture King Henry and collect his ransom. English soldiers, by contrast, sat in silence, shivering in the rain, making their peace with God. Many confessed their sins to priests, preparing to die. This was the night before St. Crispin's Day. October 25th dawned cold and grey. The battlefield was a recently ploughed field about 1,000 yards wide, bordered by thick woods on both sides. Rain had turned the soil to thick, sucking mud. The French deployed in 3 massive lines, dismounted knights and men-at-arms in the center, cavalry on the flanks. It was an intimidating sight. Thousands of armored warriors, the flower of French chivalry, ready to crush the outnumbered English. Henry positioned his army carefully. His 1,000 men-at-arms formed the center, dismounted knights fighting on foot. On each flank, he placed wedges of longbowmen, and in front of the archers, he ordered stakes driven into the ground at angles, sharpened wooden posts designed to impale charging cavalry. It was a defensive formation perfected over decades of English warfare. Hold the center. Let the longbows destroy the enemy. Refuse to break. Then Henry gave the speech. We don't know exactly what he said. Shakespeare wrote the famous version 184 years later. But we know the core message from contemporary accounts. This is St. Crispin's Day. If we're marked to die, we're enough to do our country loss. If we live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. The speech worked. Sick, exhausted men straightened their backs. Archers checked their bowstrings. Knights gripped their swords. If they had to die, they'd die fighting. And maybe, just maybe, they'd survive to tell their grandchildren about this day. Around 11 a.m., the battle began. The French cavalry charged first, thousands of armored horsemen thundering toward the English flanks. They expected to ride down the archers, scatter them, then crush the English center. They didn't account for the mud or the longbow. English longbowmen could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Each wedge of archers, roughly 2,500 men per flank, could launch 25,000 to 30,000 arrows every minute. The sky literally darkened with arrows. Horses screamed as bodkin point arrows pierced their flanks and legs. Knights were struck in gaps in their armor, face, arms, legs. The cavalry charge faltered, then broke. Wounded horses panicked, throwing riders, trampling infantry. The attack collapsed before reaching the English line. Then the French dismounted, knights advanced. Thousands of men in full plate armor, the best equipped warriors in Europe, marching across the muddy field toward the English center. This was what French tactics relied on. Armored men-at-arms closing with the enemy, overwhelming them through weight of numbers and superior equipment. It should have worked. The mud destroyed them. Plate armor weighed 50 to 60 pounds. Walking through thick, sucking clay while wearing that weight was exhausting. The French lowered their visors to protect against arrows, restricting vision and breathing. They slogged forward, step by agonizing step, while English longbowmen poured arrows into them. Arrows couldn't penetrate the best plate armor on the chest, but they could punch through the thinner armor on arms, legs, joints. They could strike unarmored horses, causing carnage in the rear ranks. They could pierce visors, faces, necks. The French kept advancing, but hundreds fell. The mud gathered on their boots and legs, adding pounds of sticky clay to every step. They were exhausted before they even reached the English line. When the French finally closed, the English men-at-arms met them with swords, axes, and hammers. The fighting was brutal and desperate. Armored men hacking at each other, trying to find gaps in armor, wrestling in the mud. The French had numbers, but the confined space prevented them from using their advantage. They were packed so tightly that men couldn't lift their weapons properly. The English, fighting on drier ground, had more room to maneuver. And then the English archers entered the melee. Exhausted French knights, wallowing in mud, couldn't defend themselves against lightly armored bowmen swinging axes and mallets. Archers targeted joints, necks, faces, anywhere armor was weak. They pulled down knights drowning in mud and armor. They dragged nobles away for ransom. The French line was being systematically destroyed. Henry himself fought in the thick of it. A French knight struck his helmet so hard it bent inward and dented the gold crown attached to it. But Henry kept fighting. The English saw their king, young and brave, refusing to abandon his men. It inspired them. If their king would fight, so would they. The French second line advanced, fresh troops trying to reinforce the collapsing first line. But they walked into the same nightmare. Mud, arrows, exhausted men blocking their path. The battlefield was carpeted with French dead and wounded. Walking over bodies in mud while arrows fell was impossible. The second French attack stalled, then broke. Around 1 p.m., something controversial happened. French soldiers attacked the English baggage train at the rear, killing unarmed servants and threatening Henry's prisoners. Henry, concerned about a renewed attack and unable to spare men to guard prisoners, gave an order that horrified even his contemporaries: kill the French prisoners. It violated the code of chivalry. Captured nobles paid ransoms. Killing them was both dishonorable and unprofitable. But Henry wasn't being cruel. He was being practical. He couldn't guard prisoners while fighting a battle. If the French rallied, prisoners might rearm themselves. He couldn't take the risk. English soldiers, however reluctantly, obeyed. Hundreds of French nobles died, not in battle, but in execution. It remains Agincourt's darkest moment, the price of Henry's pragmatism. By mid-afternoon, the battle was over. The French army had disintegrated. Their third line, seeing the carnage, withdrew without engaging. Thousands of French lay dead or dying in the mud. English soldiers walked the battlefield, killing wounded enemies and gathering prisoners who'd survived Henry's order, mostly nobles too valuable to execute. The casualties tell the story. English losses: approximately 400 killed, including the Duke of York and Earl of Suffolk. French losses: between 6,000 and 10,000 dead, including the constable, 3 dukes, 6 counts, 90 barons, and nearly 2,000 knights. It was a slaughter. The mud was so soaked with blood it remained stained for weeks. Bodies were piled so thick they formed walls. French nobility had been culled in a single afternoon. Henry had won the impossible victory. Against 6-to-1 odds, with a sick and exhausted army, he destroyed the finest military force in Europe. The victory was so complete, so unexpected. The people across Europe struggled to believe it. How had it happened? Divine intervention? English military superiority? French incompetence? The answer was all of these and more. The terrain, narrow, muddy, confined, negated French numerical advantage. The longbow, in skilled hands, was the deadliest weapon in medieval warfare, capable of stopping armored knights before they could engage. English discipline held where French nobility's pride led to chaos. And Henry's leadership, his speech, his courage, his tactical decisions, inspired his men to fight beyond normal human endurance. From an English perspective, Agincourt was proof of national character. Against impossible odds, English soldiers had stood firm and triumphed. It validated the longbow tradition, the yeoman archer class, the English way of war. It made Henry V a national hero and established a legend that would sustain English military pride for centuries. Shakespeare's play, written in 1599, cemented Agincourt's place in English culture. The St. Crispin's Day speech, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," became one of the most famous passages in English literature. Actors have delivered it to inspire audiences during wars, crises, and moments of national peril. Winston Churchill knew the speech by heart. It represents something fundamental in English self-perception. The brave underdog, facing overwhelming odds, refusing to surrender. From a French perspective, Agincourt was catastrophe. French nobility had been slaughtered. The loss humiliated France and allowed Henry to conquer Normandy over the following years. By 1420, the Treaty of Troyes named Henry V heir to the French throne. If Henry had lived longer, he died in 1422 at age 35, he might have become King of France. Agincourt nearly ended French independence, but France eventually won the 100 Years' War. Henry died young. His son, Henry VI, inherited both crowns but lacked his father's ability. By 1429, Joan of Arc had inspired French resistance. By 1453, England had lost all French territories except Calais. Agincourt's victory proved temporary. France survived, united, and expelled the English. The battle didn't change the war's ultimate outcome, just delayed it 38 years. Yet Agincourt's influence transcended military outcomes. It demonstrated that heavily armored cavalry, the dominant military force for centuries, could be defeated by disciplined infantry and ranged weapons. The lesson wasn't new. Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 had taught it already, but Agincourt reinforced it dramatically. Medieval warfare was changing. The age of chivalry, where armored knights dominated battlefields, was ending. The age of professional armies, combining pike, bow, and eventually gunpowder, was beginning. Today, the battlefield at Agincourt is peaceful French farmland. There's a small museum, a monument, walking paths. You can stand where Henry positioned his archers and look across the field where French knights charged to their deaths. Archaeologists have found arrowheads, armor fragments, mass graves. The evidence confirms the chronicles. This was slaughter on an industrial scale, thousands dying in hours. October 25th remains significant in English culture. St. Crispin's Day is remembered primarily for Agincourt now, not for the martyred shoemakers whose feast day it originally commemorated. English history is full of famous battles: Hastings, Crécy, Waterloo, Trafalgar. But Agincourt holds unique emotional resonance. It's the underdog story, the impossible victory, the moment when courage and faith defeated material superiority. The longbow that won Agincourt would fade from military use within 2 centuries, replaced by firearms. But its legend endured. The English longbow became a symbol of English military prowess, even after technology made it obsolete. Archery remained culturally significant. Even today, British Olympic archers compete under the weight of Agincourt's legacy. Henry V himself became England's warrior king ideal: brave, pious, charismatic, victorious. Later kings invoked his memory to inspire soldiers. Henry VIII styled himself a new Henry V. Elizabeth I's speeches echoed Henry's rhetoric. Winston Churchill referenced Agincourt during World War II. The battle became shorthand for English determination against overwhelming odds. Within 7 years of Agincourt, Henry V died from dysentery, the same disease that had devastated his army before the battle. He died young, at the height of his power, having conquered half of France. His son inherited 2 kingdoms but lost both. The Plantagenet dynasty collapsed in the Wars of the Roses. Henry's great victory, his brilliant career, ultimately changed little permanently. But the legend? The legend lasted forever. That's what makes Agincourt matter. Not the strategic consequences, which proved temporary, not even the tactical lessons which were already known, but the story, the speech, the courage, the victory against impossible odds. It's a story about refusing to accept defeat when defeat seems certain, about brotherhood between king and common soldier, about how sometimes, against all logic, the underdog wins. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the moments that built a nation's character, the battles that became legends, the speeches that echo through centuries, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other legendary English victories should we cover? Crécy, where the longbow first proved itself. Poitiers, where the Black Prince captured the French king. The battles that made England great? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.